Hamish de Bretton-Gordon is a retired British Army colonel, former NATO and UK's commander of chemical, biological and nuclear reaction troops. Welcome to our program, Colonel Hamish.
Thank you very much for having me.
Vladimir Putin is ready to end the war against Ukraine and does not oppose the West aiding Ukraine if Ukraine never joins NATO, according to Bloomberg. Do you see this development as another sign that Vladimir Putin is ready to settle the war and he would like Donald Trump to settle this war this year?
Well, let's hope that's the case. I mean, certainly it's a real opportunity. I think with President Trump taking over in the White House today, who seems very determined to create a ceasefire. He's seen his predecessor, President Biden, create a ceasefire in Gaza. And for Trump, that personally, I'm sure that is what he's after. I think some of the things that he's been saying over the recent weeks and months have been encouraging as well. I think some time ago we thought maybe Trump might try and do a deal that more favored Putin than Ukraine, but certainly the mood music, what the information coming out of the new White House now suggests that actually Trump is prepared to be far more hard-lined with Putin and really give him an ultimatum. I think, as we've discussed before, and is discussed very widely in the media, that the Russian economy is in dire straits at the moment. The Russian military have lost an incredible amount of soldiers, and they're struggling to maintain that. So it would see that actually Putin may well be looking for a way out. But I expect, I'm sure President Zelensky will only agree to a ceasefire that is on terms favourable to Ukraine rather than allowing Putin off the hook. So, yeah, I think it is a positive move, and everybody in the world hopes that we can have a ceasefire as soon as possible that suits the people of Ukraine and the president of Ukraine.
Also, Financial Times and Bloomberg reported that Trump's incoming administration would help Ukraine to negotiate with Russia from a position of strength. Meanwhile, Pete Hegseth, the incoming U.S. Secretary of Defense, said that he would like to see the end of the war in Ukraine on favorable for Ukraine terms. Do you see these developments as worst Putin's nightmare?
Yes, I think it is. Absolutely. I expect Putin was rather hoping that President Trump would ask the Ukraine government to agree a ceasefire on the current lines where the current forces are. And I don't think anybody would suggest that was entirely favorable to Ukraine. Ukraine obviously holds quite a significant chunk of Russia in the Kursk region at the moment, and that puts them in a very strong negotiating position. And again, as you've described, what is being said in Washington at the moment is very much the line that whatever ceasefire comes into place must have Ukraine on the front foot, as it were, with the advantage. And at the moment, with Russia occupying Crimea and various other Ukraine oblasts in the south and east, then that would suggest that President Trump is keen to either support Ukraine to retake some of that land or to force Putin to withdraw if Putin, as has been reported, is now keen for a ceasefire. So we shall see in the coming days. President Trump has said in the last 24 hours that he is going to do an awful lot of activity, including get involved in the war in Europe and the Russian illegal invasion of Ukraine pretty quickly. So no doubt over the next couple of days, we will hopefully see the sort of things that Trump intends to do. But the bottom line is that all that's coming out of the States at the moment is that a ceasefire must be to the advantage of Ukraine and not Russia.
Also, Bloomberg reported that Vladimir Putin would be ready to some territory swaps during negotiations. Do you see this big opportunity for Ukraine to exchange the Kursk region of Russia, which is partly controlled by the Ukrainian army, to the Ukrainian territories occupied by the Russian army?
Yes, I do, absolutely. And I think I am sure, not that I know with any certainty, that when the Ukrainian military attacked into Kursk, back in the summer, that was exactly what was in the minds of Ukrainian generals, that if they held a bit of Russia, and particularly the area of Kursk, which is so sacred to the Russian people after the battles there in the Second World War, that it would provide them with a very powerful negotiating tool. And I think that is exactly what we're seeing now. So I am sure President Trump is telling Putin that if he wants Kursk back, he's going to have to trade, a significant amount of the ground that he's illegally taken from Ukraine in the war. Now, exactly what ground that is, I expect that'll be very much up to the Ukraine government and the Ukraine people to negotiate. But certainly it is a powerful tool, and that is the inference. That is the sort of, again, the music coming out of Washington, the US at the moment, that there will be a trade-off of territory before any ceasefire is signed, and it is to be at the advantage of Ukraine and not the advantage of Russia.
Also, according to Bloomberg, Kremlin's position is that NATO members can continue to send weaponry to Ukraine under security agreements, but any of such weapons should be used against Russian territory in case of a ceasefire. Do you see this new position of Kremlin as a big U-turn in Vladimir Putin's stance? Because Vladimir Putin has been opposed Ukraine receiving Western aid for a while. Since the beginning of full-scale invasion, Vladimir Putin has threatened to disrupt this chain of supply of Western weapons from the West to Ukraine. But now it seems like he open to this idea that Ukraine can receive Western aid in case of a ceasefire.
Yeah, I mean, this is remarkable. And if this is true, it would seem to be a very big U-turn by Putin. And let's hope it's true, because it's sort of an indication of the precarious, very dangerous position that Putin is in himself. It makes a lot of sense, though, as well, once there is a ceasefire, that Ukraine maintains a powerful force. But there's also a lot of talk in the media at the moment that there may well be a peacekeeping force, and both President Trump and the previous Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Boris Johnson, have suggested that force should be led by British troops, British Army, Navy and Air Force, and the British government have not openly welcomed that, but again, they have not taken that particular card off the table. It might well be that that Putin, in allowing NATO military aid and other humanitarian aid to flow into Ukraine after a ceasefire, is also his way of trying to prevent Ukraine becoming a full member of NATO. So I'm sure there is an awful lot of negotiation discussions to happen at the moment, but certainly in the early part of 2025, things seem to be much more favourable towards the ceasefire and towards Ukraine than perhaps they were 6 to 12 months ago.
How can you assess the possible scenarios for a ceasefire and negotiations between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin? Because Trump, according to CNN, directed his aides to prepare a phone call between US President Trump and Vladimir Putin. So how can you assess the possible scenarios? How do you see the possible scenarios of these talks? How can they turn out during this year?
Well, certainly you're absolutely right. There appears to be, or certainly the White House is saying there's already a phone call arranged between Trump and Putin to talk about a ceasefire. And no doubt in that discussion, Trump will be detailing exactly what that will look like. And I expect, as has been reported, he will be telling Putin it can either be, the hard way or the easy way, as it were. Trump and his team have made it quite clear that if Putin is not receptive to a ceasefire, then America will double down on its efforts and increase its support and effort towards Ukraine, which actually could lead to a much worse solution for Putin than what is being suggested, that he needs to trade some land and go into a ceasefire. I think there are also many scenarios of how that ceasefire is going to be run and policed. And there is a lot of talk that NATO troops, particularly British and French troops, could be involved in that. Now, President Putin might have something to say about that, but one gets the feeling that, he is not exactly being backed into a corner, but it is clear that Putin is struggling, and it is clear that President Trump appears, to have the whip hand here and has the possibility to really, tell Putin how it is. But we shall see. Unfortunately, although the phone call might be fairly soon, in the next few days or few weeks, it'll still take some time for the details to come out and the mechanism of a ceasefire to get into place. The simple fact of moving tens of thousands of British and French troops and whoever else is supporting them into Ukraine to set up the ceasefire, will take time, and that's for sure. But I think it's the green shoots that hopefully will develop into something much more substantial. And whatever people think about President Trump, he does appear to be the one person who could actually direct Putin what to do, and hopefully lead to a ceasefire that's acceptable to President Zelensky and the Ukrainian people.
Do you feel that Trump's presidency has turned out to be the worst scenario for Vladimir Putin, and it would be a bad option for Vladimir Putin? It appears to be the worst scenario rather than Biden's presidency, Harris' presidency.
Well, let's hope so, and that is what it's looking like at the moment. But having said that, of course, President Trump, does change his views and opinions quite regularly. But it's very clear that he wants a major victory that can be associated directly with him at the start of his presidency. Although we now have a ceasefire in Gaza, a lot of the work presumably was done by his predecessor, President Biden, and I expect that is something that Trump is not overly happy about. So it's clear that Trump wants to flex his muscles to show that he is the most powerful leader in the world, and what better way to do it than force a peace on Putin that is advantageous to the Ukrainian people rather than the Kremlin and the Russian people. So yeah, I think President Putin, when he realized that Trump was going to be the next prime minister of the US, that was a pretty bad day for him. And all the things that we discussed earlier on in this interview coming out about Putin's change in mind and change in direction is suggesting that now he realizes that this ceasefire and peace is going to be forced on him, and he's got to try and save his own skin, as it were. Failed dictators in Russia rarely collect their pensions, and I expect Putin is worried about his own future probably more than anything else. So he's trying to, maneuver into a peace and ceasefire that means that he can still carry on as president of Russia rather than having to step down, which is, a distinct possibility, because no doubt, although Putin is an autocratic leader, there are a lot of other very powerful people around him too, who I'm sure would be very happy to jump into his position if Putin shows any weakness from an internal perspective. But yeah, we're all keeping our fingers crossed that the arrival of President Trump in the White House will also lead to the removal of Russians from Ukraine and peace for Ukraine at last.
Also, do you feel that a ceasefire could be the best way for Vladimir Putin to safe to retain his grip on power, or on the other hand, you think that a ceasefire could lead to the deposition, to the physical threat for Vladimir Putin, a threat for his grip on power?
Well, it's very difficult to see. I mean, there are a number of scenarios, absolutely. It could save Putin because we know that he's struggling, his army's struggling, and the country is struggling. But equally, also, it could lead to his demise. I think, quite frankly, us in the Western world really don't care what happens to Putin. What we care about is what happens in Ukraine, and we want to see peace as soon as possible. The war might go on for a bit longer, but nobody wants to see any more sort of civilians or military people killed than is absolutely necessary. So, the best scenario would be a peace, a ceasefire that's negotiated, and a swap of territory to a position where the people of Ukraine are content with it. And quite frankly, what happens to Putin after that happens, well, that's up for the Russian people. And as long as it doesn't affect the rest of us, I don't suppose anybody will lose too much sleep about what happens to him in the future.
Also, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer says that he was open to the idea of sending peacekeeping forces to Ukraine during his visit to Ukraine, first visit to Kyiv. From your perspective, also, what kind of peacekeeping mission would be the best option for Ukraine? Also, The Telegraph described 3 scenarios of Western peacekeeping deployment to Ukraine: peacekeeping patrolling the buffer zone, Western troops defending Ukrainian capital, and at least a training mission in the west of Ukraine. What kind of option is better for Ukraine?
Well, that's a really good question. I've written about it myself in the Telegraph as well. And having been a peace enforcer in Bosnia back in the 90s and a peacekeeper in Cyprus in a bit later than that, I have personal experience of doing it. I mean, it can take up an awful lot of soldiers, and especially with a border of over 800 miles between Russia and Ukraine, to cover every single blade of grass would require tens, if not hundreds of thousands of soldiers. I think what you need is a credible force to prevent Russia attacking. And I think the good thing about having British troops, one assumes that the Russians would not attack British troops. The challenge with British troops is that British military is so small now. It's a real wake-up call for the British government to make sure that they invest sufficiently in defence so that we have a credible defence, so that we can do roles like this. I expect it will be a combination of various things, maybe with a command and control structure based on the British military, but with support from perhaps the French and the Scandinavian militaries to provide quick reaction forces that could act if there's any transgression of the ceasefire. And allied to that, of course, as well, training for the Ukraine military to make sure that they have the capabilities that they will need in the future. So we shall see. I mean, I'm very glad that the UK Prime Minister Starmer has said that British troops would be available for this sort of task. I think British troops are excellent at doing this. And with the French suggesting that they would have troops available, and I would have thought also other European NATO countries would get involved, it's clear that European NATO countries could provide a credible force that would prevent the Russians going any further. And I don't think anybody would suggest that the Ukrainian forces would attack this ceasefire force either. So the key thing is, and I hope that there's a lot of planning going on in Western capitals to make sure that as soon as the agreement is made, this force can get in place as soon as possible and provide a credible deterrence to any further fighting.
Times reported that victory of Ukraine was never President Biden's goal, because White House was confident that Ukraine wasn't been able to do so because it was beyond Ukraine's ability. What is your take on such a political legacy of President Biden and his decisions on Ukraine?
Well, it's very difficult. I mean, and when one describes what a victory is, that could be that is a many-faceted area. Whether Biden was talking about Ukraine completely retaking all the land that Russia took from 2014 onwards is difficult to understand. But it's certainly clear that President Biden didn't commit, 100% to Ukraine in order to defeat the Russians. Certainly, the Americans produced an awful lot of military capability, far more than anybody else, and provided a lot of intelligence. But it was clear that was not enough, decisive enough. I think everybody, military analysts like me, would say that the US military is by far the most powerful military in the world. And if they fully committed to this, the Russians would have been defeated some time ago. But of course, Biden had other competing ideas, and that was not within his rationale. I think the difference with Trump is that he wants things over very quickly, and is not prepared to go into a protracted conflict in Europe between the Russians and Ukrainian military, and sees that in the long run for the US, it would be far better to get it over and done with very quickly. Whereas President Biden rather, didn't see it that way. So, I think we're in that President Trump is in the White House. There is a feeling, I think, on all sides that actually things are going to move quickly now, and they are going to end as quickly as possible. And with President Trump pulling the strings, driving this forward, one hopes, and it would appear that whatever happens is going to be to the advantage of Ukraine, who of course has suffered from the illegal invasion of Russia, and rather than Putin, who perhaps thought maybe 12 months ago that Trump would likely save him, rather than, as we're led to believe now, Trump really wants to run Putin out of Ukraine and get back to a peaceful solution in Europe as soon as possible.
That's also our situation in the Middle East. From your perspective, do you feel that a ceasefire in Gaza can bring the war in Ukraine closer to its end? Don't you think that this political victory of the United States could strengthen US position during the negotiations with Vladimir Putin? Because at the same time, Putin has lost his Assad's regime, has lost his military presence, military bases in Syria. And second question is, what are your impressions on your last visit to Syria?
Well, certainly on the first area, absolutely. With it looks like a ceasefire that will hopefully hold in Gaza, and also the activities of the Israeli military over the last 6 months, particular by destroying the Iranian militias. Mostly Hezbollah, really that, and the fact that the Hezbollah were keeping the Assad regime in power in Syria, which allowed Russia to have its powerful bases in Syria and its southern flank. When the Iranian militias collapsed, so did Russia, and Putin was humiliated and had to scuttle out of Syria at great speed. So I think we now have a much weakened Iranian regime. There is no Assad regime for Putin to lie on the back of. And that's a whole series of defeats. And, on a military battlefield, momentum is absolutely key. And the momentum is completely against Putin at the moment. Over the last 6 months, he has just failed. So I think what happens in the Middle East has a significant impact, because it's also what the Russian people see. They see that, in effect, the Russians have been defeated in Syria, and that their allies, the Iranians, have been defeated in Gaza and in Lebanon as well. So that is just not a good look. For my myself, having spent the last week in Syria, it's a very great delight to me. Have been involved in Syria really for the last 14 years, mainly helping in the areas where Assad was trying to attack into, to help the hospitals and the schools, the infrastructure keep running. Now that Assad is gone, there is a dark cloud lifted off the country, and there is hope, so much hope for the future. And absolutely, now that the Russians have left Syria, and the Russians were hated as much, if not more, than the Assad regime for the dreadful things that they did in Syria, bombing schools and hospitals, exactly the same activity we've seen the Russians in Ukraine. So having seen what has happened in Syria, what one just hopes that similar will happen in Ukraine. And now those of us who have been involved in Syria are looking to try and help them rebuild. So there is hope. I think when I woke up on the 1st of January this year, things look pretty grim around the world. But in the last few weeks, with the demise of Assad in Syria, the ceasefire in Gaza, and hopefully a ceasefire in Ukraine to come soon, perhaps things are looking a little bit brighter than they did in 2024. And let's hope 2025 delivers everything that the Ukraine people deserve and desire, and creates a peace in the Middle East so that Islamists like the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda cannot develop and grow and threaten people around the world. So, yeah, there is a chance that 2025 is going to be a good year, and let's hope it is, and let's pray that it is.
We hope too, Colonel Hamish. Thank you for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Thank you very much indeed. Glory to Ukraine.